Hello and welcome to another edition of Local Heroes, brought to you by WKFK TV7 in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and the GI Museum in Goshen. Tonight we have a real special guest. He needs no introduction to most of you people in Jackson County, but in case you don't know him, and I don't think there's anybody that doesn't know this man, is Manly Barton, District 1 Supervisor and President of our Board of Supervisors. Manly, thank you for being here on the show.
Well, I appreciate you having me.
Well, let's get started, Manly, and let's talk about how you got into the military in about 1969.
I had, of course, there was no lottery at the time when I got drafted, and I had a friend who had gotten a draft notice about the same time I got a draft notice, and he was going a little ahead of me, and we decided to go together, so I went and joined. So that he and I could go in at the same time. And so I went in and around the end of February, 1st of March of '69.
And from there you were processed and you went to basic training.
Went to basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana. It's pretty cold in Louisiana in 1st of March.
Yeah.
It was an interesting, that was an interesting experience. Probably the best shape I've ever been in my life when I came out of there. You know, when you come out of basic training, especially during the Vietnam War, the concern was being infantry. But in some ways, I was very fortunate. When I finished basic training, I got assigned to quartermaster school at Fort Lee, Virginia, and went there, spent 10 weeks at Fort Lee, Virginia, and came out of there with an MOS, a job title of Petroleum Storage Specialist. And so that was, learned how to work in a kind of like a petroleum tank farm. And so that's kind of how I got my start. And then immediately I got my orders to Vietnam. And in fact, it was funny that the classes at Fort Lee, it was pretty obvious. Every week there was a class that graduated. And one week the whole class would go to Vietnam, and the next week the whole class would go somewhere else. We had figured it out. We were about the 4th or 5th week. By the 10th week, we were all going to go somewhere else. We were kind of happy. And about 2 or 3 weeks before we finished, the cycle started changing. Instead of everybody going to one place or the other, they started splitting the classes. And so when it came to our class, about half the class went to Vietnam and about half the class went to other places. And I was one of the ones that went to Vietnam.
Anything memorable about basic that other than how in shape you were, the training? Or?
It was, yeah, I made a lot of friends during basic training, a few of which I ran into later in life and later in Vietnam in particular. Very demanding. I look back on it, you know, it would be difficult for someone a little older to probably to put up with some of the stuff that we put up with. But of course, we didn't know any better. I was 19, 20 years old, and so. But it was very challenging, obviously, and but I look back on it, and I wouldn't take anything for having gone through it, and. It was something that I probably wouldn't want to do again, but there was, you know, a lot of the same harassments that everybody hears, you know, about, you know, the Foot Locker routines at 2 o'clock in the morning, and, you know, burying a cigarette butt, and, you know, those kind of things that probably everybody's been through basic training has either seen or participated in. Long marches, long runs, early in the morning, late at night. But here again, met a lot of really good people too, and including the people that were assigned to train us. You know, we had several changes at like squad leader and so forth during the cycle, and somewhere I don't remember exactly how far over into the cycle it was, but I ended up being a squad leader. I wasn't to begin with. But near the end, maybe halfway through or so, I had an opportunity to be a squad leader for a while, and I stayed squad leader till we graduated. So But that was interesting, and immediately had to take on some responsibility and so forth.
Did that training help you in what you're doing today? In your leadership role that you've...
Probably so. I think so. It forced me at a very early age, and especially later, say a year after that, when I was in Vietnam. Those kind of roles that you took on, you were given a task or given a job and expected to carry it out, and so I think there's something to be said for. I mean, I look back on it and I think it's hard for me to believe at this point in my life, looking back as to how young I was, and in these situations, to think that somebody actually gave me that responsibility when I was that young, but they did, and they expected me to do it, and they expected the other people who took on similar tasks to do the same thing. And so, but I think you're right. I think having had that experience, having had those responsibilities early, and I think through those, I think it helps you through a lot of things you do in your life to be maybe more confident, more outspoken if you need to be. But yeah, I think the training and all of the stuff that the experiences that I had probably all influenced the person I became.
So you get through basic, and did you have a little time off before they shipped you out? Did you get to come home?
The first airplane I ever got on was when I went to Fort Lee, Virginia, from Louisiana. They took us from Fort Polk, put us on a bus, carried us up to an airport somewhere. I couldn't tell you where we went. And we got on an airplane, and they flew us to somewhere in Virginia, Richmond, I guess, in that area. And they picked us up in a bus and carried us to Fort Lee, and that was the first plane ride I was ever on. And so then I spent 10 weeks at Fort Lee.
And then you got out of your AIT at Fort Lee, and no time between Fort Lee and Vietnam. You went straight to Vietnam.
No, I had 30 days.
30 days.
When I had my orders from Fort Lee, I had a 30-day leave, and so I came home. Actually, drove home, and from Fort Lee, and spent 30 days at home. Then flew from Mobile. In fact, it's kind of interesting. We went to Mobile, got on the plane in Mobile, and flew to New Orleans. Had to change planes in New Orleans. So it was about a 15, 20-minute ride to New Orleans and get back off the plane, and then had a several-hour layover. And while I was waiting, flying into Oakland, Oakland Airport, going to the Oakland Army base, two other people came in that I knew that were going at the same time I was. And we actually flew on the same plane to Oakland together, that were also going to Vietnam.
See, and you get to Oakland after your 30-day leave, and you're there. You probably did you get your jungle fatigues there, or did you?
No. We had the, and I forget exactly. It seemed like it was khakis, best I remember, but we had what we had been issued in AIT, and was there for. I think we came in that night, had to report in before 11 o'clock or something that night. Got reported in. We're there for maybe the next day, and then we shipped out, I think, the day after, where we took a flight out the next day going to Vietnam. Went through Hawaii, through Guam.
Standard route.
Standard route, yeah.
And you landed in Vietnam at?
Bien Hoa.
Bien Hoa.
And went to the 90th Replacement Center, best I remember, and got in late that afternoon and ate, got us a place to stay that night, or a cot, and ate, had a little free time that night, and was told to report out the next morning, fall out. They were going to have a big reporting, and so we did that, and they actually had us all out in a field, and I don't remember how many people there were there, but it was several hundred. It was not probably in the thousands, but it was several hundred of us. And they just started calling names. said, okay, when I call your name, had a loudspeaker and had several banners around, 1st Cav banner, big red one, 101st Cavalry Division, and said, when I call your name, you go to the banner that I call. You know, and so he said, okay, everybody that I'm fixing to call, you need to go to the 101st Airborne. So he called a bunch of names. Well, when he got to the 1st Cav, we were standing back in the back kind of talking, you know how people do, and he said, okay, the next group is 1st Cavalry Division. And show you how little I knew about the Army. Mine was the very first name called. And I almost missed it. You know, he says first, and he says, Barton, Manly, G. And I said, did he call my name? And they were all, yeah, I think so.
It starts with a B.
I think so. And I said, 1st Cavalry Division. I said, that must be a mistake. So I walked over there and told the sergeant who I was. He checked me off his list, and I said, are we sure that's right? He said, son, the Army doesn't make mistakes. He said, go over there instead. So then we actually went through a 3-day, what they call charm school in Vietnam. And had to requalify. We'd actually qualified on M14s in basic trainings. I'd never shot an M16. But that's where we were issued weapons and this type of stuff. I got it issued an M16. We had to qualify on it. Also qualified on a on a M60. And and that was an interesting. I'd never shot a machine gun. And but then after 3 days, all we knew at that point was that we were in the 1st Cav. We didn't know what unit we were going to. And then at the end of that 3 days, we got our orders for the units. And I got assigned to the 227th Assault Helicopter Battalion.
We're going to have to stop you on that little note right there, Mandy, because we're going to have to take a break. Don't go away. We'll be right back with more of this interesting story with Manly Barton. Welcome back to Local Heroes here on WKFK TV7 in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Tonight our special guest is Mr. Manly Barton. And Manly, before we went to the break, we had just gotten you to Vietnam, and you were out there in the middle of that field, and you'd just been assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division.
So I ended up in the 1st Cavalry Division. Didn't know exactly where I was going, and ended up at a 3-day short, kind of an abbreviated training session, orientation into Vietnam, I guess is one way of putting it. And but it was there we were issued rifles and had to qualify. We had actually qualified in basic training on M14s, and we were given M16s in Vietnam, and we also had to qualify with the M60 machine gun. And so after the 3 days of that training, I was assigned to the 227th Assault Helicopter Battalion. First helicopter ride I was in was when they picked me up from the school to carry me to battalion headquarters at Phu Vinh, which was about an hour north of there. The next morning, the helicopter landed and picked myself up and a couple of others that had been assigned to that battalion. And so that was a little scary and a little thrilling at the same time to get on the helicopter and then fly and then kind of flying across the countryside. It was, most of the countryside, to be honest with you, was very pretty. And the helicopter was flying, I don't know how fast at that point, but it was not very high off the ground. We were kind of low-level flying. And so that was my kind of introduction to helicopters. But I ended up in a helicopter battalion and actually over the course of the year flew a lot.
Then what happened? Where did you go from there?
Well, my initial assignment was, I guess, kind of interesting in the sense that when I got there, the battalion commander interviewed the 3 of us that came in, and when he got to me, he wanted to know what I had been trained for. My job that I'd been trained for in quartermaster school was petroleum storage specialist. So he asked me to kind of explain a little bit about what that was, and when I was talking about I was trained to work in a tank farm and this type of stuff, he said, in fact, he kind of looked out the window and he said, "We don't, as you can see, we don't have a tank farm here." And that didn't really make me feel real good. And I said, okay. And he said, but then he asked me some other questions. He asked me if, he looked at my records and saw that I had done okay on the M60 qualifying in the little charm school. But then he asked me in the school that I had attended, had we refueled any helicopters and those types of things, and I told him we had. And so he said, and even then he said something about that. Well, we're thinking about doing some things with refueling and so forth, so we may be able to utilize you a little better. But my initial assignment was to the headquarters company, working. I was assigned to supply, but as kind of a backup door gunner in the headquarters company. But I actually really never did that. Never had to do it because within a few weeks they called me back in and said they were going to start refueling and rearming, setting up these remote rearming and refueling places. And so I was sometime probably in the latter part of, I got there 1st of August, so this was probably in maybe the 1st of September or so. I was sent to a Special Forces camp at Loch Ness, and then spent the next 3 months there manning one of these remote refueling places. And that was interesting, being around the Special Forces people every day. And I stayed in the Special Forces camp, slept there, ate there, and really got to know them fairly well. And kind of a unique group of people.
Yes, they are.
And but at the same time, there was a village there, Loch Ness, and we knew got to know a lot of the kids and so forth. They came up every day to help. They'd be around you all the time, and they were always wanting something, So we had plenty of sea rations and those kind of things. So we would give the kids food and treats and different things. And so I had in many ways had a lot of fun with the kids in particular because we got to know them fairly well.
Describe for the viewers exactly what your job entailed as far as refueling helicopters, and you didn't refuel them from a tank form, obviously. What were you refueling the helicopters from? You give us a little idea about that.
We had what they call 500-gallon blivets, bladders, and so we had just a real small pump that you could actually pick up and run with. I mean, they didn't weigh very much. Had a small gasoline engine on it, and so we had a hose that we would suck the fuel out of these blivets, 500 gallons at a time, pump it through the small pump, and then the outside you'd have a small hose that you could put it into the helicopters. And these blivets were designed so that they could be taken into small places and even on an emergency basis. In fact, we went many times to where we would go, be lifted into a place and drop down to a small landing zone or whatever to refuel one helicopter that was coming in. And we'd be there and the helicopter would come in, we'd refuel them. Then we would actually get on the helicopter and leave with them. I mean, the only purpose for us being there was to refuel that one helicopter. Many times it was sky cranes hauling very heavy loads where they didn't have enough fuel to go from one base to the other. They had to refuel somewhere in the middle where there was no LZs, no landing zones or fire support bases for them to refuel. We'd set up an emergency one in the field. But that's basically what we did at the Special Forces camps also. But we had a lot more of those blivets. We got supplied almost every day by division with additional blivets, and then we would use those, and they'd come in every so often, take the empties and bring them back full. So.
And the blivets were made out of?
Rubber.
And they would sling load them in under the...
That's right. They would sling load them in. A Huey was big enough to haul one or two of them, so it didn't have to be a Chinook or some very large helicopter. They could bring us 1,000 gallons pretty easily. That we could then use to fuel other helicopters. But we also rearmed the gunships. So we had 40 millimeter belted ammo and minigun ammo and even belted ammo for like M60 machine guns and those kinds of things, so that when crews came in, anything they needed on that ship, whether it was a gunship or whether it was a Huey or something like that, we could supply them with ammunition or fuel.
As a man, with all that fuel out there, I'm sure that was a target at times.
Yeah, it was. We every once in a while we would get mortar rounds or sometimes sniper fire, but really not very often on the sniper fire. Had a lot of our fuel would come up missing at night because this was all obviously outside the wire. So we would keep, usually not very much, but we would keep maybe 55 gallons of MoGas just to run our pumps, regular gasoline, as opposed to the jet fuel. And of course the people in the village used they were always looking for gasoline for their motor scooters and their cars and everything else. So regular gasoline was hard to keep. If you kept it out there, they would steal it pretty quick. So we had to be very creative to either hide it or at least maybe not leave it out there. So that was some of the interesting things that would happen to us. But we would move around. I spent 5 months at Loch Ness, spent 3 months at another Special Forces camp called Duc Phong. But then from there, we would go, such as I explained a while ago, if they had something we needed to leave there and go set up an emergency point someplace else for a couple of days or maybe even for one day, we would do that. And we did that quite a bit.
How many people would do that? You say we. How many individuals?
Probably, over the course of the year that I was there, we had as many as just myself and maybe one or two others. I think the most we ever had in our little group was during probably May of '70 when Nixon sent the troops into Cambodia. We were set up at Loch Ness. That was actually the jumping off point to go into Cambodia. And several of us went into Cambodia, including myself. Spent about a month in Cambodia, I guess, but then several was there. We had probably 5 or 6 at that point, but that was probably the most we ever had assigned to the group.
So they're taking you out on a remote location, sometimes you, yourself, and just another guy.
Oh, yeah.
Did you feel a little lonely?
More than once. More than once. Most of the time, they would put us at a place where there were some other people. But occasionally, it was you be by yourself.
Manly, unfortunately, we're out of time for this show, but we promise that we're going to continue this story on the next episode of Local Heroes on WKFK TV7 in Pascagoula. Please, you don't want to miss this one. In fuel storage, and you were in Vietnam, and you were telling us about your job in Vietnam, which was taking fuel blizzards out to these remote locations and refueling helicopters. And there was one particular time when you were out on a refueling mission that something happened to you.
I had been at a Special Forces camp called Duc Phong, and the 1st Cavalry Division was reestablishing an area north of Duc Phong in the southern part of the Central Highlands, and they had established a fire support base there, where an old Special Forces camp had been at one time. There was actually part of a runway there, and we went up, or I did, to establish really an emergency refueling operation there, just to support establishing that fire support base. So we came in probably the second day that the infantry was there to get it established, so we could refuel gunships and medevac ships or anybody that needed fuel there. And so we did that. And the first night we were there, we were really getting everything established, and it was kind of quiet. The second day, we had quite a bit of activity there. But then late that second day we were there, we started taking some sniper fire, then took probably several hours worth of mortar fire. And then probably late that night, sometime around midnight or so, had a pretty good probe where they tried to break through one side of the compound. This was not much of a compound, I might add. It was mostly just some concertina wire in a big circle. Had a few sandbags, and we'd built a few bunkers, and small bunkers, but not big bunkers by any means. And then really got through the night okay. There was some little activity that night. There were several people got wounded, and medevac ships came in and so forth. But the next morning, we actually went outside of the little compound area down a couple hundred yards to check our supplies, our fuel blivets, and of course the fuel blivets are rubber, and sometimes they get shot and they leak and so forth. And so we'd gone down to check that and check our ammo and so forth. Had been down there for not very long, 15, 20 minutes, I guess. And I had actually turned around to walk back into the compound to get something. I don't remember even what it was now. And I walked probably 150 feet or so and heard something. And as I turned, a mortar hit pretty close. And I really kind of got what I call the side blast. It wasn't aimed at me. It was kind of aimed at the compound, and I got kind of the side blast and got knocked down and didn't have a shirt on. I guess that's one thing that I always remember was that when I kind of came to my senses laying on the ground, I remember thinking that I had a lot of blood on me, and I could taste blood in my mouth, and didn't know it at the time, but 2 small pieces had actually gone through my cheek. And so I was bleeding on the inside of my mouth a little bit. Not much, but enough to taste blood. And but I didn't have a shirt on, and as I laid there, I had 50 or 60 little bitty cuts here and there, and it's kind of like getting shot with bird shot or something, I guess. And but I remember thinking that I didn't really feel any pain, and I had a couple places on my arm that was bleeding pretty good, and I'm thinking I'm dying. I know I'm dying. And the first couple of people that got to me tried to reassure me that I was okay, that I was going to be okay. I thought they were lying. They put some bandages on me, and probably within about 20 minutes or so, maybe it could have been a little longer than that, but around in that time period, the medevac ship came in, and I remember on the medevac ship, the medic, he checked me out pretty good, took the bandages off they had on, put new bandages on me, but then he assured me that I was going to be all right, and I thought he was lying. And so that was an interesting ride, and then they took me to Long Bend, to the Long Bend Hospital, and they put me on a cold steel bed in a kind of a large room that had a lot of other steel beds in it, and the thing I remember was it was so cold in there, and but it was an interesting morning, and I was okay. I mean, I was hurt, but I wasn't hurt terribly, and got okay. Spent a couple of days there, and then was on convalescent for a little while. But that was an interesting time.
Yeah, and of course your dad. And if people don't know who he is, and everybody in Jackson County knows who your dad is or was, he got notified. Tell us the story about how your dad found out that you had been wounded in Vietnam.
Well, and I don't know that I even knew this at the time, as far as the timing was concerned, or didn't realize that it was Easter weekend when I got wounded. I actually got wounded on Saturday before Easter Sunday. And my dad was, at that time, preaching at Van Cleve Baptist. And the person who was delivering the telegram showed up at church prior to the 11 o'clock Easter Sunday service. And one of the men in the church talked to him, found out what it was all about, found out that I was okay, that I wasn't dead, that it was just a wound, and convinced him to wait till after church to give it to my dad. So my dad preached Easter Sunday service that morning, and when he went out of the back of the church to greet people at the end of the service, this guy was standing there waiting for him with a telegram saying that I'd been wounded. So it was kind of a traumatic day for them too, I'm sure.
Yeah, that was your Purple Heart.
That was my Purple Heart, that's right.
But I also know that you've got a Bronze Star. Do you want to relate or give us a little bit of how you managed that one?
Well, actually, it was the same day.
The same day?
Yeah. From the timing standpoint, a little earlier in the morning, before I got wounded, same morning, we came under attack, and probably a lot of people find themselves in this situation, at the wrong place at the wrong time. Just kind of got caught where you didn't want to be when people started shooting at you. I think most people who receive those kinds of awards, very few of them went into something like that looking for something like that.
Oh, no, I don't think everybody wanted one.
And so I think I look back on it, and I've thought about this many, many times through the years. I think anybody who was in the same situation at the same moment would have probably reacted the same way. I would like to think that. I think we reacted based on experience and training and everything else, and out of survival. I mean, that was part of. There were people shooting at us. So
of course, yes.
So it was a matter of we had there was a ground attack, and got caught outside the wire, and so we actually in some ways was in a good spot, because they were concentrating their fire on the compound, and we were actually myself and one other guy was actually to the side of them, and caught them a little off guard, and so when we started firing, they retreated pretty quick. But as you can well imagine, when we started firing, we had an awful lot of fire trained back on us pretty quick, and we didn't have a whole lot of cover, but it was over with pretty quick too, and so I was very fortunate to come through that without a scratch, I might add. So, but that was but later I got a Bronze Star for valor for that.
Yes, with the V device. I wanted to
right.
make sure everybody knew that one. Bronze Star with the V device, valor.
And so, but that was interesting. I appreciated them, doing that, but I really didn't expect it, to be honest with you.
Most GIs don't expect any decorations, man. You know that. Folks, we're going to have to take a short break here, but we'll be right back with more of this story from Manly Barton. Welcome back to Local Heroes here on WKFK TV 7, and we're talking to Mr. Manly Barton. Manly, we'd left you off in our last segment, and you had just you've been awarded the Bronze Star with a V device. But if you look at your shadow box, there's another one in there. Could you tell us about that one?
Well, the Bronze Star can be awarded for valor or heroism or whatever, but it can also be awarded for meritorious service. And so the other Bronze Star that I received that's what it was for. It was for meritorious service, and really I think had more to do with my battalion commander trying to reward me for what he considered to be a good job, doing the refueling operations that I'd been involved in pretty much the whole year that I was in Vietnam.
And you also were awarded the Army Commendation Medal.
Right, and for similar reasons. It was for meritorious service, but for other things other than maybe the refueling operation. But I think the Bronze Star had more to do with the refueling operation and those missions that I went on for the refueling than it did anything else. And the Army Commendation Medal was maybe kind of overall doing a good job, maybe, I guess.
And then you were awarded the Air Medal.
Right. I was assigned to an aviation battalion and actually did a lot of flying. And they had a policy of you could be awarded an Air Medal if you had more than 25 combat flying hours. And they kept logs, and they knew when you flew and when you didn't fly, and how the hours for that particular helicopter, your flight time was logged as either combat hours or non-combat hours. So in the year that I was there, I accumulated more than 25 combat hours, and so that's the reason I was awarded the Air Medal.
And I want to also mention you were awarded the National Defense, and you were awarded the Vietnam Service, and you were awarded Vietnam Service with the 60 bar on the medal also. But here's a young man from Jackson County, Mississippi. On his third plane ride, he goes to Vietnam. First time he ever rides a helicopter is in Vietnam, and you've just told us about you've ridden a lot in helicopters. Did you ever get where you enjoyed it or liked it or looked forward to it?
Well, I got used to it.
You got used to it.
And actually, I enjoyed flying. I really did. Certainly flew sometimes when it was very nerve-wracking. But actually, I guess I enjoyed it enough that when I came home from Vietnam, I decided I wanted to get a pilot's license and fly some here. And so I did that in the early 70s, and went through and did my 40 hours, and fixed wing, not helicopter. But I was actually working with some folks at the time that flew and had pilot's license, and so I flew some with them. So I did that, but like a lot of things, I kind of lost interest in it just in a little while. But I was young and I wanted to do it, and so it was, some of it was real fun. And some of the pilots we flew with in Vietnam were amazing. They really were. I mean, we had some pilots that were just unbelievable, where they could put a helicopter or get it out of, and so sometimes it could be real exhilarating. Somebody said something one time about flying was hours and hours of boredom interrupted by sheer terror.
Yes.
Moments of sheer terror.
Yes.
But yeah, it could get exciting real quick.
Now, when you learned how to refuel helicopters, I'm sure there was a procedure that the Army taught you, and could you tell us what that procedure was?
Well, it's kind of funny because when I was in AIT, we refueled a couple of helicopters, and when we did, they went through about a 15-20 minute procedure just to get to the point where you'd start refueling it. You shut the helicopter down, nobody approached it until all the blades had stopped and all the engines were down, and then you'd go up and you'd make sure the grounds were all in place before you ever even started a pump or started fueling it or anything. And then you certainly didn't crank the helicopter up until everything was finished and disconnected and everybody had backed away from it. Well, in Vietnam, it didn't work that way. When those helicopters came in and landed, they wanted fuel right that moment. So nobody shut an engine down. And but it was, and that was, the first time I mean, I figured out pretty quick they weren't going to do it the way they did it in AIT. But my introduction was when the first guy landed, and it was pretty obvious he was not going to shut that helicopter down before I refueled him. And but that was kind of funny, I guess, looking back on it now, that my introduction was pretty abrupt.
And you said you could look through the cockpit and you could see the fuel gauge in pounds. And
that's right.
And usually the pilot or the co-pilot would point to how much fuel he wanted. So that's kind of, you didn't look at a fuel gauge.
Right.
You just looked up.
Right. It wasn't gallons. It was usually pounds. And somebody would indicate to you how much they wanted, and you could see the gauges and so forth. So you'd fuel up to what he wanted, and then you'd back away and they'd take off.
Did you ever have a ground wire all with you at all times?
Didn't have one at all times. We did have one occasionally.
But you never used it a lot, did you?
Probably didn't use it as much as we should have. Looking back, that was, but you did what you did.
When you first got to Vietnam, I think you said in talking with you earlier, it was like 3 days after you'd gotten there. You had a little bit of a close call. Can you tell us about that? Rocket hit your.
I thought you meant when I was at. Within when I first got to Vietnam, we spent a couple of days at the what we call the Charm School. Then I went to my unit, and about 3 days into that, we were actually sitting in the hooch. The hooches had exactly how big they were, but had 16 little AOs in them for sleeping purposes, but the other end of the building actually got hit with a 122 rocket. We were all actually sitting in the other end of the building, and it was very, 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 very loud in that small building. But none of us got hurt, but it was kind of a harrowing experience.
You're right. There's a picture of you holding the souvenir of that little.
Yeah, that picture was taken the next morning, but that was my introduction, I guess, in a way. That was the first mortar attack, rocket attack that I'd been under, and the thing actually hit the building that I was in. So,
did you have like an awakening of like, oh my God, somebody might be shooting at me in this country?
Yeah, and you kind of went through this, what have I got myself into, or what am I doing here, kind of thing. And I think we all went through some of that as our year went along, and the longer you were there, I won't say you got used to it, because you didn't. I don't think I was ever unafraid, but you kind of got used to the fact that you were in that circumstance, and you just kind of learned to live with it or kind of deal with it.
Did you just allude a minute ago to another close call?
No. I mean, there was. I guess there was lots of little things that could have been close calls, I guess, but there were other times, and I can remember thinking. I give you a good example. I was actually showering during the middle of the day. We'd come back to Phu Bien. I'd gone over to take a shower, and while I was in the shower, some mortars hit, and some of the shrapnel actually came through the tin walls of the shower. And I ran out of the shower as quickly as I could to a slit trench, and then out of the slit trench into a bunker. And really didn't realize until I got into the bunker, the only thing I had was my wash rag and my soap, which I still had retained possession of. And so that's a close call, I guess.
Yeah.
But that was a little, and it really wasn't so much scary at the time. I was just trying to get to that bunker, and it wasn't until after it was all over with we kind of looked back and laughed about it. It was all over with at that point. But there was little times like that, I guess. There was a few moments like that was
if
funny,
you could
looking back on it.
If you could you give the people a sense of kind of your living quarters, your facilities where you lived, and kind of what they looked like? And you said AO, that's area of operation.
Yeah, we called it an AO. It was the building. I probably about 30, maybe 40, 50 feet long, but it had a little lane down the middle, and on either side we had little rooms, if you want to call it that, but the walls didn't go all the way to the ceiling. And we had 2 beds in each AO. And so there were 16 beds in a hooch. And the outside of the walls were wooden, and we had sandbags built up about 5 feet on the outside. And so where your bed was, everybody had their beds against the outside wall, so your bed was actually literally next to a wall of sandbags. No sandbags on the roof. And so generally, if you came under attack, the safest place to be would be to go under your bed and roll all the way up against the wall, because you're literally up against the sandbags.
And the shower facility?
Facilities didn't have any sandbags around them. They were just tin. And tin walls, tin roofs. So shrapnel will come through that tin pretty quick.
And it wasn't like a shower facility that you have at your house?
Oh, no. It's a very large room, and cold water, and there's concrete floor, and that was it. And so you actually got water out of a barrel, 55-gallon drum on the roof.
Gravity fed.
Gravity fed, that's right. So you turn it on, get soaked up, turn it on, wash off. So it
Were
was
you showering in the middle of the day trying to get a little heat out of that water in that 55-gallon drum?
well, it was a shower of opportunity. I had been out in the field. And we just came in that day, so I decided I'd run over and get a shower during the day when I could, when it wasn't crowded. But anyway.
And in our first show, you mentioned the locals. You befriended some of them, and you actually had some kids that would come by.
Yeah. We had quite a few when I was in the field at Fook Bend, Loch Ness, all of those. There were villages near, so they would come up all the time, and we talked to them, and especially the kids in particular. But even at the base camps at Fook Bend, a lot of people worked inside the compound. So we had people, hooch maids, women who cleaned the hooches, and we had people that, like a barber. Every battalion had its own barber, and the barber was Vietnamese and so forth. So we saw a lot of the locals, but didn't have a lot of interaction with them, but some.
And you were communicating, of course, this is before email, and this is before instant messaging, and this is before cell phones. So you're communicating with home with letters.
That's right, and get a letter every 2 or 3 days or whatever.
Did you have time to write a whole lot of letters?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote some. I don't remember how many. Don't remember, but I managed to get letters out every week, to different people. So.
And that was your only connection.
Mm-hmm.
No calls home, no instant
home.
messaging, no emails. It's not anything like it is now.
No.
I remember when my son was in Iraq, I could talk to him on instant messaging in
Every
my
day.
office.
Yeah.
If he happened to be on.
Yeah.
But the folks at home couldn't communicate with you like that.
Not very well.
Manly, we're out of time for this show, but we're gonna bring Manly back for an unprecedented third show because this story is so fascinating and so interesting. So tune in again next week for the third episode of this show of Local Heroes with Manly Barton. Hello and welcome to Local Heroes here on WKFK TV 7, coming to you from the GI Museum in Goshen, Mississippi. This is the third show with someone I consider a very, very close friend. That's Mr. Manly Barton, our District 1 Supervisor and our President of the Board of Supervisors for Jackson County. In the first two shows, we've talked about his Vietnam service. But Manly, as any GI knows that's overseas.
At Special Forces Camp at Loch Ness, and we started the evening with a little Christmas dinner. There was 8 or 9 Americans there.
Remember what you had?
I really don't. It was some kind of turkey, breast of, GI turkey breast. But had a pretty good meal, and we sat around and talked a little bit in this underground kind of bunker thing they had there inside the Special Forces Camp. And then the night kind of wore on, and it got to be 10:30, 11 o'clock. I don't know exactly what time it was, and everybody kind of drifted away from where the little entertainment area was downstairs. And I walked outside and walked down to one of the bunkers and just kind of sat up there and thought about Christmas and family, and pretty much wallowed in self-pity that I was in Vietnam and everybody else was home opening presents and visiting with family and so forth. And that was probably, probably the low point of that whole year, because here I was kind of by myself in a way. I knew kind of what my family was experiencing at home, and Christmas was very, very special at our house, and so not being a part of that year was kind of hurt, to not be there, but I sat out there for a little while and felt sorry for myself, but eventually went to bed, I guess, and got up the next day and went on. But that was a pretty low point that night. It really was. But the next day was Christmas Day, and we actually had several people come in that day and brought us a few things, including the USO girls came in, and the donut dollies. And
how'd they arrive?
They arrived in a Caribou. Twin-engine cargo plane that was painted up to look like Santa Claus, and they lowered the ramp on the back. It has a ho 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 on the ramp, and they set out a little cardboard or temporary bar type thing that kind of looked like brick, and had cookies and donuts and cake and different things for the guys. And I guess they were flying into all the small bases like that where people couldn't get back to a big base for Christmas. And so they were, I forget how many of us that were there. There were 7 or 8 of us, maybe 9 of us there, Americans at that particular place. But it was a Special Forces camp. And but that was an interesting day. Interesting Christmas.
Yeah, I bet it was. Cambodia. You had been wounded. You were recuperating. You were on convalescence. And it was somewhere around the end of April, 1st of May.
I was wounded on the 28th of March and had kind of several weeks to kind of recuperate and get my wounds healed and so forth. And about the middle of April, I decided to go ahead and take my R&R since I was already kind of on light duty, and did so. And when I came back off our R&R was on April the 28th, and that was in 1970. And when I got in, I was told that they wanted to see me at battalion headquarters, and so I went down to battalion, and they told me then that I needed to get enough stuff together to feed us, several of us, for about 30 days, and get all the equipment we needed to refuel with, and get it all together. And the next day we were flown out to Loc Ninh. That would be on the 29th. And on May the 1st was when President Nixon sent the troops into Cambodia. And Loc Ninh was the jumping off point. So those last 2 days we were there, thousands of helicopters came in and out of there bringing supplies and troops and kind of building up for those 2 days. And the last night of the month before they kicked off the next morning, there was 7,000 or 8,000 infantry troops sleeping on both sides of the runway. And then that morning, literally from one end of that runway to the other was helicopters lined up from one end to the other, waiting on 6 a.m. When they wound them up and loaded them up, and first load took off, and they were gone for 45 minutes, and they came back, and the second load loaded up, and they left, and then we were in the third load, the group I was with, and we waited, and they came back, and we loaded on those helicopters, and that was an interesting ride because I was in Vietnam and kind of used to being there, and didn't really know what we were fixing to get into in Cambodia, but it ended up going to a place called LZ David, in a very, very, very open area. It's kind of like somebody going out in the middle of a 400 or 500 acre cow pasture and building a LZ right in the middle of it. There was no trees. Trees were there, but they were way off. And it was actually it was beautiful country, and it was kind of rolling hills, and you had all this what looked like pasture. And it was very different, even though it was only 30, 45 minutes away. But obviously Cambodia had a lot of jungle and all, just like Vietnam did. But this particular area was not. It was very open and very, like I say, it was almost like pasture where we were. And but I spent almost a month there, and came back in the latter part of May back to Loc Ninh.
And you were when you were there for 30 days. It was basically a POL point. You were refueling helicopters with the Blivets, and it was yourself and.
Usually, sometimes it was just me. We actually had a couple of LZs in Cambodia, and we had a presence at each one. So sometimes it was just me. Maybe sometimes it was me and maybe one other person. But it was a small emergency type refueling. We didn't keep a lot of fuel there, and so it was. We did a lot of refueling, but they supplied us with 3 and 4 blivets at a time. We never had a lot of fuel there at any one time.
And you're there by yourself sometimes?
Oh, no, not here. This was an LZ, and there were a couple of hundred infantry troops there all the time. And it was a fire support base also, so there was the artillery folks there.
On this big LZ in Cambodia?
This is in Cambodia,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Right.
But you were the only guy there that was refueling
Right.
helicopters.
I was the only one from our unit that was there.
So after you come back out of Cambodia,
Back to Loc Ninh, and spent probably another week or two there, and then I ended up back at Phuc Binh, which was our base camp. And then, but off and on throughout that, the rest of my tour, I spent more time, weeks at a time at either Loc Ninh or Duc Phong, which was the other Special Forces camp. So I spent, and a day or two here and a day or two there at different places, wherever they needed a refueling operation set up.
and most of the time you're by yourself.
Well, sometimes we were, from my unit,
yes.
from my unit, that's true.
Amazing, a one-man operation.
Well, we didn't take a whole lot. We had a pump and a bladder, and if you had the pump and you had the fuel, you could refuel somebody. So, but normally we would be at either a forward support, a fire support base, or some type of landing zone where there were infantry troops and maybe artillery people. So we were by ourselves in the sense that there was nobody else from our unit there, but we did have other support troops there. But it would be a small place.
But at times you were out there by yourself with just a PRC-25 radio.
That's right. Yeah,
an M16, a few
right.
C rations, and
Right.
some canteens.
Yeah, a couple of times.
Couple of times.
Yeah, several times.
Wow, that's lonely. That is
Well,
lonely.
but usually those times they were supposed to be short. A couple hours, and they'd bring you in, you'd refuel somebody, and then they'd pick you up. And but it was, but they got a little fun at times.
And your tour is winding down now. July, you left in August of 70?
Left in August of 70. Came home for 30 days, basically, and then finished up my tour at Fort Hood, Texas. Spent 6 months at Fort Hood and finished up there, and came home in the latter part of February. Got out, I guess it was the last day of February in 1970.
When you went to Fort Hood, what were you doing at Fort Hood?
I was actually the training NCO for a training battalion there, or a training battalion at Fort Hood.
I want to get this on the show. When you got to Vietnam, you were an E3.
E3, right.
But when you left Vietnam, you were a
E5.
E5, staff sergeant. Pretty amazing that you were promoted that quickly. But as anybody knows, if you want to get promoted, you be in combat, and that's the way to do it. But also, you must have been doing something right, Manly, because you got the Army Commendation Medal and the Bronze Star for the things that you were doing. We're going to have to take a short break here. Don't go away. We're going to come back with more local heroes here on WKFK TV7. Welcome back to Local Heroes here on WKFK TV7. We've been talking to Mr. Manly Barton about his service in Vietnam. Manly, before we went to the break, we had wound your service down, basically. You were finishing up in Vietnam. It's August 1970. You get on a plane in Vietnam, and you go toward home. Can you tell us about that?
Well, just leaving Vietnam was a little traumatic, I guess, in a way, because, for a year, I checked off every day on a calendar. Can't wait till that day gets here when I can come home. And then when the day got there, there's a big part of me didn't want to leave, because I was leaving a lot of my very, very, very best friends there. And so that kind of started the trip home. It wasn't that I didn't want to come home, wasn't that I didn't want to come see my family and so forth, but I was leaving some pretty important people. And I came home. I had orders to report to Fort Hood, Texas for my last 6 months, but I had 30 days leave to come home to Van Cleve, Mississippi. And So from the time I got on the plane in Vietnam till the time I rode into downtown Vankleigh was about probably 48 hours. So it's a pretty quick turnaround, considering that probably, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 days before that, I'd been flying in and out of some small fire support base in Vietnam, and less than a week later, I'm in downtown Vankleigh with my friends. So that was a pretty dramatic or drastic change of environment, and I'm not sure that, you know, looking back on it in particular, I'm not sure that I handled it very well. I was, when I got home, you know, I had lived and breathed and, you know, that Vietnam experience, I guess, every day for a year. And then all of a sudden I ended up at home, and Vietnam was not the top of the discussion. You know, it was, most people were more interested in what they were going to do this weekend than they were what was going on in Vietnam today. And that hurt a little bit, I think. I mean, especially looking back on it. I struggle with that some, and the fact that it was kind of important to me, and it didn't seem to be important to them. And I don't know, looking back on it, I don't know that they didn't think it was important. It just that was not the center of their life, and so that was something that took a little getting used to, and I didn't get used to it very well. And so the 30 days I was home, and then I went to Fort Hood, I struggled with that a little bit, and then after I got out of the service and came home, I think I continued to struggle with that, and I think a lot of other veterans did too. Vietnam was not something people wanted to talk about. It wasn't any parades as such. Not that I don't think we really wanted a parade as such, but it was not something people wanted to talk about. And so I think most veterans, and me included, kind of pushed those memories and things. It was something that had happened to us, but it wasn't something that we talked a great deal about because it just didn't get brought up a whole lot. People didn't want to talk about it. So it was, and I dealt with that. I guess everybody dealt with it in their own ways, but you know, for probably 20 years, it just wasn't an issue because we didn't make it an issue. We just didn't talk about it, and you know, I was lucky in a way. Maybe I never had any nightmares. I didn't really struggle with a lot of that. I had times when I was restless, and I had a hard time sleeping if I'd watch a movie or if I'd read a book or something. My wife she'd tell me, "You don't need to watch that movie, you know, you don't need to read that book." And she was right in a sense, because then I would struggle with that for a week or two sometimes. And then I'd get over it and I'd go on and everything would be okay. But it was something that I just really kind of avoided. I mean, we didn't talk about it a whole lot. And that, you know, that went on for a long time, probably 20 years.
Did you get to talk to your grandfather about any of that?
When I first came home from Vietnam, my grandfather was in his early 80s at the time. He had actually served in World War I, and one of the more unique things, and I've talked about this at some things that I've done, I talk about Veterans Day was very important to him, because when we think about Veterans Day or Armistice Day, think about the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month type of thing. But my grandfather always thought of it as a moment in time, because he remembered when everything got quiet.
He remembered the 11th hour?
He remembered that 11th hour. He was there. He was in the trenches when the war ended. And he was one of those people that once the war ended, after a little while, climbed up out of the foxholes and actually walked across the middle and visited with the Germans. And they swapped guns and pistols and things like that. My grandfather actually brought home a pistol that a German officer gave him.
Amazing.
That morning. And so he and I talked probably more after I came back from Vietnam than we did before. And I, especially looking back on it, my grandfather died about a year or two after I came home. But in that time period, he and I talked several times. And I look back on it, and he talked to me about things during that period of time that he never talked to me about before I went to Vietnam. And I knew he'd been in World War I, and I knew some things. But after I came back, it was almost as though now maybe he and I had something in common. And he would talk about things with me then, I think, that before he didn't talk about. And I equate that to perhaps the fact that I had been maybe in war or whatever, and he maybe felt some connection there that maybe wasn't there before. I don't know, but he did talk about things that he didn't talk about before, and but he was a good guy.
Yeah, your whole family's full of good guys, Manly. The wall in Washington. Did you ever make it there?
Yeah, I did. When they started designing it and building it and everything, I kept up with it some. And when it was built, I remember when they had the grand opening, so to speak, and a lot of people were there. And I guess there was a part of me want to go to it. But I just had kind of told myself that I really didn't want to go. I mean, I really didn't need to go. And part of me was, I think, not wanting to go for some of the same reasons that I didn't want to read a book about Vietnam or I didn't want to see a movie about Vietnam. I just didn't know how that was going to play with my emotions and other things that I thought might come into play. But early in 1991 time frame, I had a real good friend who, he and I were good friends in Vietnam, and he had been to the wall, and he called me and really encouraged me over a period of time to go. And in 1991, I believe it was, my wife and I did go. And it was probably the most emotional thing I've ever done in my life. It was very much like that you could just, you were there with everybody. It was...
So that was a healing experience.
It really was. It's difficult to explain, and I think people who have been there have experienced the similar emotions. But I've never had anything affect me like that first time. Now, I've actually been back to the wall many times since then, and it's still emotional, and it's emotional every time I go, but not like the first time. The first time was I've never ever experienced that kind of emotional outpouring, and you see other people there, and you see people who are experiencing the same thing you are, and some for the first time, and so it's but it is a wall that heals. I mean, I think that's a good way to describe it, and it really made a difference in me.
There's a lot of other veterans who've been there. A lot of other people. It really helped them out a whole lot. Well, Manly, we're about to the end of the show. Is there anything special you'd like to leave our viewers with?
Well, I think just that, the people that serve in our military and serve our country is they're our neighbors, our brothers, our sisters, our husbands, our wives today, and we need to do whatever we can to show them that they're appreciated. Yes,
sir, I agree with that wholeheartedly.
And just anything that, anytime you have an opportunity to do that, and I think that's important. I mean, I can't think of anything. I look back on my time, and I think that was one of the things that the Vietnam veterans in particular have struggled with, was that that they didn't feel like they were appreciated. And I think that's changed. I think people look back, and even people who criticized the soldiers in the 60s and 70s, I think even a lot of those people have now said, well, you know, they were really criticizing the wrong people. And but at the time it hurt, and it took a lot of people a long time to get over some of that hurt.
Well, I'd like to say now that you and your entire family are probably some of the best people I've ever known. And the Vietnam veteran is probably one of the most unappreciated and misunderstood veterans out there. And I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, but I want to say thank you very much, Manly Barton. I appreciate it. That'll do it for this episode of Local Heroes. Please join us again next week for another episode here on WKFK TV 7.